Hello, everybody. Welcome in. We're going to give everyone just a quick minute or so to get settled as they start piling on in. We have some people in the background as always. We're going to have a quick poll up. Feel free to pop your answers in. We're going to be talking about data today, so we want to know how often do you have the data you need to be confident in your enrollment management strategy. So go ahead and pop your votes in while we are still getting some people in here. We'll give it still another minute. Sometimes I'm seeing are the popular answers to start off. Always. We love seeing that. Split right now. I love seeing that. That's fun. A few more going through. Welcome in, welcome in. If you're just joining, feel free to put your answers in the poll. We're talking about our data today. How often do you have the data you need to feel confident in your enrollment management strategy? And as you guys are going and putting in your answers, we are going to go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are new, welcome. To those of you who are joining us for the second time, third time, maybe the fourth time, welcome back. We are excited to have the very first Cadence campus live of the new year. So what is Cadence campus? So in the past, every month, we had the Cadence campus newsletter, and that would bring you content highlights, product sneak peeks, and student engagement tips. And then every other couple months, we would have Cadence boot camps, and those were going to be focusing on hot topics across campus. So we thought we would combine both of those to make one convenient webinar for everybody to get the most out of Cadence and everything else. So why not combine them both to bring you the content that you love? And this is going to be a 30-minute webinar series to give you a little sneak peek behind those who are using Cadence and those behind the scenes of Cadence as well. Which brings me to my guests today. Joining me today are Dr. Steve McKellips, Vice President of Enrollment Management at the University of Akron, and my A1 since day one here at Mongoose, Alex Keppel, Business Intelligence Analyst here on the product team. And I do have a quick story about Alex. On my first day, I was wandering the parking lot here at Mongoose trying to find the door that I needed to walk in. Alex grabbed me and said, "Hey, are you Gary?" Recognizing me from LinkedIn that we were able to connect in beforehand. So thank you, Alex. I don't know if I've ever officially thanked you for saving me from that parking lot that day. So do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Alex, and then tell us a little bit about your role here at Mongoose as well?
Thanks, Gary. You stole my story. It's one of my favorite ones to tell. I was about 1 week in here at Mongoose when I found Gary lost in the parking lot. So I'm Alex Keppel, Business Intelligence Analyst. I am here at Mongoose to help our partners identify trends and provide actionable insights for our team and your team to help make improvements in your communication strategies.
Thanks, Alex. And I am now going to get into it. We're actually going to stop sharing. We're going to let this be a little bit more of a conversation of sorts. So joining me is Steve. Steve, why don't you tell us kind of one, who you are, what your role is at the University of Akron, and then a little bit about what got you started in using data as well.
Well, thank you for letting me be here. I appreciate it. I'm excited for the conversation. My name, as you said, I'm Steve McKellips. I'm the Vice Provost for Enrollment Management at the University of Akron. I've been in higher ed, particularly in enrollment, since probably '96. So I've been doing this a while, came through the admissions, I guess you'd say, track. So what really kind of sparked me off in terms of being interested in data really kind of started early on when we were trying to maximize the number of students who would physically come to see us, whether that's at a college fair or a high school visit or what have you. So you kind of learn very early on in that world how to prime the pump a little bit to try and get the most response from the activities that you're ultimately doing. But what's interesting about starting when I did is I started before the internet. So I've watched the internet and the behaviors associated with the internet really change the structures in terms of how you reach out and how you connect with people. So for me, and then ultimately going on and having my own children in this technical age who are going through the experience in a completely different way than I did, it was really interesting to watch, to watch behavior change and the tools change and the mechanisms change, but the goals be the same. So it's been interesting to watch. And so for me, what has always kind of piqued my interest the most was just being able to figure out how we can communicate most effectively to get the information that we have to the people who need to hear it. They use different tools, different strategies, different priorities than maybe higher ed has seen before. So the higher ed has to change with it to try and get the information in consumable ways to the people who are supposed to hear it using the channels they use today.
That's great. In our like pre-planning meeting, you talked about a little bit about your dissertation, and you had a funny little story about your daughter and whether or not she was going to be responding to you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, if anybody sees her, don't tell her we're talking about this. So one of the things that was of interest to me in my dissertation, I tried to study whether or not sending messages to students could help them complete the financial aid application. And if I changed the message, wrote it differently, what have you, if I would change the outcomes. But one of the things that was interesting that I found in the dissertation was something I wasn't looking for, but it's something that higher ed has historically identified, and that is that people don't open their emails. We've kind of come to just accept that to be true. But ironically, that's not really what I found. What I found is 75% of women and 66.7% of men, so 3/4 of the women and 2/3 of the men, would open their email. So basically a quarter, a third would not. And then every time you sent a message, it was a different quarter or a different third. So that as the sender, you never know who was going to be the group that opened or didn't open your message. And I thought that was interesting that every message had the same open rates, but really very different people were the ones choosing to either ignore or miss the message altogether. And then I thought about my daughter, who probably only answers a percentage of the texts and communication that I send to her. But when I talk to her, I'll hear, oh yeah, I knew that. I responded and I knew it, but I'm not going to waste my time to message you back or to communicate. So I found my daughter using all these technologies to stay in touch with her friends, but I still have to have some version of priority for her to respond back to me. So it kind of taught me that you have to rank in order to get people to respond, not just to have people get a message and they'll respond, but you have to be important enough to warrant a response. And so it was really humbling to be a parent and not have my child respond to a person who's looking at their phone, 17 to 20 hours of a day. So yeah, it was a real telling kind of experience, because that's the noise we operate in higher ed, is even dad won't get a text back. So it's interesting to see how reality is playing out in these media related constructs for attention, and higher ed has to find its way to carve through that experience as well.
That's great. So we're talking about data, and so what comes along with that are kind of like some stats and high level numbers that you're going to be seeing. So in your time at Akron, can you talk about what are some stats or data points that you take specific interest in, or that you kind of see or view as a good indicator of success?
Well, thanks for asking that. One of the things that I think is unique about data today, meaning in 2024, compared to data that we've used, is I don't think the same data points mean the same thing we've led them to believe over years. It used to be that the enrollment number was the most important number. And it's still important, but I think it's received very different realities in the modern era compared to the past. Now, what we're finding is throughout the funnel, the indicators of the performance throughout the funnel are better predictors of what's going to happen in the end, and that it's really way too early to determine what's going to happen at the end until you're closer to the end. So, for example, the behaviors that are of interest are making sure that we can get participants to fill out the request for information, or to get people to attend a campus visit, or make the data clear that they can come and take a tour. So I call those the little victories. But the truth is that for us to measure whether or not the messages are effective or the behaviors are getting what you need to do, you have to measure the steps along the way. So you have to maximize the attendance at an event. You have to maximize the participation and the follow through. And in the past, you never had to do that. You could just simply do and exercise those activities. And in the end, you could pretty much predict how many would come through. And that predictability has really fallen off. And so our ability to acknowledge that melt has never been higher, double depositing has never been higher. The construct around people being in an uncommitted state till the very, very end forces us to have indications along the way that are maybe more valuable to us than they've ever been before. But we've really not built our systems to track them in that same kind of way as much as we maybe need to. We're really focused on the number who matriculate in the end, but we're maybe not as careful to identify whether or not our marketing messages are actually filling our rooms for our programming efforts or what have you. So I really think that's the big telling sign, is in the modern era, it's these little victories that need to get a lot more attention than maybe the big one. You know, the whole win the battle, lose the war arguments that are out there. I think we have to do a better job on the data side of the little things along the way.
So you mentioned the data isn't necessarily the same of what it's been. It can be anything from a number to a true false, like did they attend this event kind of thing. How do you make sure that you're looking at that data objectively to making sure that you're making these decisions based off of that?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest challenge. Looking at data is looking at the data to see what it says rather than what you really hope it says. It's really easy in higher ed to get data and assume everything's great. And probably the cleanest example of that is almost everybody now uses feedback forms for an event, and take this quick 7-minute survey and tell me how we did, and we all get 5s on everything we do. And our takeaway is that the event was a big hit because everybody scored it a 5. But if you really reread the questions that you asked them, you didn't really ask them if the program was a 5. You asked them, how did you like the speaker, or how did you like the breakout session? And we forget that sometimes people who are trying to matriculate somewhere don't want to be associated with providing bad news. So the inclination that somebody would artificially overscore is what makes those surveys really not scientific. Another example in higher ed is that everybody says when they leave or depart that money is one of the key reasons that they choose to attend or choose not to attend. But in fact, the reality of the money is often not what's really going on. It's people are having a bad experience and it's a lot of money. So they may say it's not worth the money for that experience, when in fact the experience is the real key to that departure, not really the money. But often schools, if you give them the reasons, will try to correct the reasons. And if you really do want to go, the one thing we typically can't correct is how much money it costs. So what we find is there's a proclivity to tell us about money because it's the one thing we really can't fight with. And so one of the things that higher ed has to remember is that people are answering in a lot of ways the data they think the other side wants to hear, which is something that forces us to take some of those answers with a bit of a grain of salt, because they're answering the questions that we ask, and in some cases don't want to just be mean or constructive right to our faces. And we think they are, and they may not be. And my evidence to that, I go back to my children. They'll be a lot more honest with me now that they know me as well as they will be, but their best friends won't be so honest when I ask them a question, because they don't want to hurt my feelings. They don't want to be rude. They don't want to be whatever. So if you think that people are inclined to provide positive answers, it forces you to really kind of take their answers with a little bit of a grain of salt, because maybe they're not telling you what you think they're telling you.
You're a good guy, Steve. No one wants to hurt your feelings.
You think.
So my next question for you is a kind of little bit of like a chicken or the egg. Which one came first? So you have this data available to you. And then as an enrollment, in charge of being an enrollment, you have goals that you need to meet. So where do you take the balance of setting goals and then seeing what the data is showing you versus looking at the data and then setting goals to improve on an area that you might see is showing up as like weaker or could be improved on?
That's a really good question. Usually the demand precedes the data. What we ultimately learn is that I wish I knew some things, but at the same time, I realize that I haven't been recording it. So I find myself needing to record it. And then once I start recording it, then I start tracking it to see how I can make it better. But usually the idea comes out before the data. We're not very good, higher ed in general, of recording data that we don't necessarily think we need until we need it. But in the same breath, the construct around do we need to get the data? I probably can't stress enough how important it is for universities and organizations to collect every piece of data they have available to us, because it is supposed to spark the interest on what needs improvement and what needs attention. We just have a history of going so fast that we typically don't collect the data we really need to collect.
That's great. Steve, in the chat, we actually have a question for you from Audrey. You mentioned earlier about the questions on your surveys. Can you kind of give us some examples of how you've modified those questions on those surveys to like kind of increase that truthfulness,
yeah, for sure,
core issues of why someone isn't committing?
Yeah, I think the most important thing in asking a question is to make sure you're asking the question that gives you the answer you're hoping to learn. And we tend to try to be a little bit nice in the other direction as well. So for example, we want to know intrinsically if they enjoyed an experience, but the truth is whether or not they enjoyed it isn't necessarily the best piece of feedback. For example, financial aid reports to me, and if you were to ask financial aid, they would tell you, if they ask the question, what was your experience like in financial aid? It's going to be directly related to how much financial aid they received. In other words, if I couldn't give you any money and then asked you what the experience was like, the scores are going to be lower than the person who suddenly went to financial aid and received a lot of money. So it's not really liking that we're looking for. So what I would argue is we have to find out what is the information we're trying to discover. So for example, did the speaker provide information that you thought was valuable? Did the speaker provide you information that was useful to you in making a decision? The context is, I really don't need to care if they enjoyed the speaker. What I really want to know is, did the speaker provide you information that you thought was valuable? So we just need to make sure we're asking the questions that if you get a yes or no, then you're getting a yes or no to the specific nugget of the question that you're looking for. Often we use Likert scales. And so we say, on a scale of 1 to 5, tell me how much, whatever. And we all get 5s. But if everybody gives you a 5, it was a bad question. The truth is that we need to think through an answer where we believe the right answer should be a 3 or 4. If the right answer is 5, then frankly, you didn't ask a question. You essentially just gave everybody the opportunity to give you what is essentially a pass or fail question. When it comes to committing to the university, one of the ways to handle that would be to ask questions about topics in general, rather than from a list of otherwise unrelated elements, tell me which ones are important. So for example, we could ask questions like about financial aid. We can say, did you receive enough financial aid to make your university experience possible? If no, what else could have been done? So the ability to put that open-endedness is important to get that feedback. But if you want to find out if financial aid is important, ask the question about financial aid, but then ask the questions about other things. Ask the questions about, describe your connectedness on campus. Do you feel as though you've made a lot of friends on campus? And by asking a series of those questions, what you can ultimately discern is they didn't like their financial aid package, but they had a very low connectedness as well. So I may not be able to influence the opportunities around how much money they had available, but I can develop the feedback that a lot of the people who depart to talk about being disconnected from the campus or what have you. So I would tell you to ask the questions you want the answers to, and if it means asking more questions, then ask more questions. But the truth is, don't ask fewer questions and extrapolate the answers that may not have been what they were ultimately reporting to.
That's a great point. Alex, I want to bring in you quickly. We've been using a lot of data here at Mongoose. Can you kind of talk about what we're doing with it and what your role is to help our clients use it?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Kind of to echo what Steve is saying with asking the right questions. In my role, obviously, I want to be able to help illustrate ROI of Cadence and Mongoose's offerings, but also understand the problems that our partners are facing and the goals that they have for the academic year and beyond, and leverage partner data to draw conclusions and update their texting strategy to follow those trends that we're identifying. One of the ways we're doing that is by implementing quarterly reviews with all of our partners and connecting with our teams to connect not just on a quarterly basis, but maybe on a monthly basis to update them on different trends that we've identified through the data that we're pulling together. With 950 plus institutions that we're working with, shameless plug there, but it gives us a tremendous amount of data to dig into as well. So that's what is really what I'm trying to do in my role to make an impact, is not just make suggestions and point out the positives that I'm identifying, but identify the ones that are going to be important to someone like Steve to make updates and make those trends into a positive, whether that's increased enrollment or decreased melts.
So being in your position now and kind of hearing Steve's thoughts, are there any takeaways that jumped out to you for our clients or even specifically to Akron?
Yeah, I've worked with Akron in the past as a former client success lead. So I mentioned it to Steve when we met earlier in the month. Great team to work with. They're always looking to make improvements and explore and understand maybe what other institutions are doing. So in my role, we are meeting with those clients, connecting about those metrics, providing those insights. But that is where, yeah, we want to be able to look at specific data points that might be incredibly important to Akron, but doesn't cross another client's mind, doesn't cross another partner's mind. So being able to connect on a regular basis and understand where they're at in their current day-to-day, and helping not just them, but helping my team support them in different ways that maybe we wouldn't have been able to in the past.
That's great. To Steve, we have a question in the chat. So from Isaac, when sending a mass text, what is an example of something you expected to work that didn't end up panning out, or vice versa? And I know something that we kind of talked about. You kind of briefly hinted at in your intro, and then as well as in our planning, is that you needed to know the importance of needing to know more about your responders. So would you say that like segmenting your data to include some more targeted messaging would be important? So kind of hitting on both of those questions for me.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Isaac, for the question. I think that it is probably the biggest mistake that higher ed makes in in the context of its communication with students, and that is the overgeneralization of the audience. If I were to tell people that first year students and transfer students are different, we would all say, of course they are. And if I said domestic students and international students are different, of course they are. And if we said that students from Ohio are different from students from, say, Alabama, yeah, of course they are. But the biggest issue in terms of how they're different is they're all at different stages of the funnel, which means even the students who live next to each other are different because they're in different stages of the funnel, and their circumstances are different, that they need different information. So I'm a communication scholar by trade. And so for me, I will tell you that the most important thing in communication is knowing your audience and giving them what they need. So we in higher ed do a great job of telling them what we think they should be doing, but we don't always do a good job of knowing who they are. So we simply push messages of do this next, and not necessarily messages that say, I see you haven't done this part yet. Let's stop and let's get this part taken care of. So a good example of losing it is my dissertation. So unfortunately, my dissertation did not prove what I wanted to prove, but I sent out 3,000 messages telling people to fill out the FAFSA. And I thought, as an enrollment manager, this is a really important dissertation for me as an enrollment manager. I can really go to school on these outcomes, and I can prove that my theories about communication are effective. And I told you the 3/4 and the 2/3 open rates, and I thought I was proving something. But I had like a 1% click-through rate on the link to go to the FAFSA, and I was mortified that I could have that many people open the message and that few people. And I ended up getting incredibly low numbers of FAFSA submissions. And then it dawned on me, to fill out the FAFSA, now forget the FAFSA going on today, that's a different thing. So this was a couple of years ago. But to submit a FAFSA, you had to have your parents' taxes with you to go and take care of that. You had to have your parents' FSA ID to be able to log in and authorize and sign. And people are reading this on their phone where they don't have any of that information available. So here I spent all this time and energy, this multi-layered communication plan to tell everybody to do their FAFSA, completely forgetting that none will and none can, but I was going to keep telling them to do it anyway. So the example that I would give to everybody is the calls to action have to be accomplishable calls to action. You have to know what your audience is needing and delivering that at every stage of the conversation. You can't just put all this pressure on these big components without recognizing that they actually can't do the thing you're telling them to do. And higher ed is really good at pay your deposit, pay your deposit, pay your deposit. But we forget that paydays are often the 1st of the month or the 15th of the month. It doesn't do you any good to send it out on the 17th of the month if everybody just spent their paycheck. So just thinking through, when am I telling people to do these things? It's really not about the dates that are important to me. It's about the dates that are important to the people who haven't done it. And so making sure that we're sensitive to where they are and what they're trying to accomplish is essential in an effective communication plan.
That's great. I think a lot of times in higher ed, I always like to say that, students don't know what they don't know. And we kind of take it for granted that of like all of the institutional knowledge that we have about the processes is that they might not know or be familiar with it. So it is a lot more hand holding that you need to kind of help them through, and making sure that you are putting yourself in their shoes. Just kind of like as each step goes through, you need to know and think about what they need to be doing in order to maximize their success, even in getting through these processes.
Right. And in an old school way, back in the 90s, we would call families and we would lead them through the process. So we would call, we would see them, we would talk to them, like there was no other way to get it done. But now that technology has replaced all that face-to-face time, it really still needs to do the same thing, which is lead them through the maze, not just tell them what the milestones are.
That's great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again real quick. Steve, we're running just out of time, so I want to thank you right away for joining us today. Alex, you as well. So I just want to give out some cheap plugs for everybody as well. Along with our Cadence Campus Live episode today.
Gary, that is your speaker notes.
Wrong screen. Thanks, Alex. We're always keeping me on track. Here is the slide that I wanted to share. As you know, every month we drop a new Cadence Campus Live, but we also drop an FYI podcast along with Gil Rogers. He is going to be sitting. The last episode was about navigating the college costs and scholarships with Kevin Ladd. He's the COO of scholarships.com. And the most recent episode is going to be battling aversion to change in higher ed, where he'll be sitting with Brian Rosenberg. Brian is an author who talks about what contributes to higher ed's aversion to change, and he offers advice on what to change. And then coming up as well is that our very own Dave Marshall is going to be featured on a virtual forum on February 13th. So mark your calendars. That forum is going to be taking through the Chronicle of Higher Education. The forum is going to focus on the summer before students start college as a crucial time to foster student success. Many colleges have started summer bridge programs to help students prepare for their transition into higher ed. So we want to know, what do experts say about making these programs work well? And then finally, we have this upcoming Cadence Campus Live schedule, so you can kind of have a quick peek at what each month is going to be focusing on. Coming up in February is our Giving Day prep episode, so you'll get tips and strategies of what we here at Mongoose have seen work well. So you'll be able to hear from experts on that as well. So I want to thank, again, everyone for joining me today, especially you, Steve, and everyone. Hopefully take care. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. We'll be able to pass them over to Steve, and then we'll be able to take it from there. But thank you again, everybody, and have a great week.